every country in the world is blighted by corruption, which unquestionably always hits the poorest the hardest. Rampant corruption easily becomes routine. People begin to accept that paying bribes and taking kickbacks are an everyday part of doing business or entering politics.
We've found some amazing young people who say, no, that's not the case. Corruption is not inevitable. It is possible for young leaders to fight it and restore dignity to their governments. Let's take a look at the findings of the 2015 Global Consultation process. If we can run the map sequence.
Huge question, and we've got amazing counsellors in this last plenary session. First up, and you haven't met him yet, at 37, he became Bolivia's youngest vice president, and 4 years later became president of the great nation of Bolivia. He's worked for the World Bank, for the IMF, and is the vice president of the Club of Madrid currently, working to promote democracy that delivers. Please welcome former President Tuto Quiroga. Bienvenido. I'm so glad you're here.
Next up, welcome back, a counsellor who's hard to define, educator, activist, TV presenter, hip-hop artist, who wowed us on Thursday in his fantastic session with Jerome Jarre, Akala.
Please welcome another major figure in Latin American politics. She's been the Ecuadorian ambassador to the USA, minister for the Galapagos Islands, president of the Andean Parliament. Please welcome Ambassador Ivonne A-Baki.
And we'll welcome back someone you just heard from, brilliant scientist and the first female president of Mauritius. Please welcome back President Ameenah.
And to introduce the plenary session with a keynote speech is another new counsellor. Mike Davis has been working for Global Witness since 2003. Global Witness is internationally recognized for bold, tenacious campaigns to expose and break links between natural resources, conflict, and corruption. 2007 to 2012, Mike managed Global Witness's portfolio of work on natural resources and conflict, encompassing minerals in Eastern DRC, oil in South Sudan, diamonds in Zimbabwe, cocoa in the Côte d'Ivoire, timber, minerals, and oil in Liberia. Currently, he's the Asia Director and based in Cambodia. Here to talk to you about how you, as young leaders, can restore dignity to government and break this terrible cycle. Please welcome Mike Davis from Global Witness. Thanks so much for coming out, Mike. Thank you.
The floor is yours. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was reading in the notes that I was sent last week that two-thirds of you, two-thirds of the community of One Young World leaders believe that corruption is holding back your countries. Well, the evidence suggests that you're probably right. The World Bank President Jim Kim, talking about the developing world, has described corruption as public enemy number one. Kofi Annan, in his 2013 Africa Progress Panel report, He found that what are known as illicit financial outflows from Africa are more than double in value to the value of international aid that comes in. And the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, trying to put a figure on one part of this problem, they've come up with a staggering figure earlier this year that money laundering globally per year is worth between $800 billion and $2 trillion. That's equivalent to between 2 and 5% of GDP. Well, we at Global Witness have been working on cases to do with corruption for around 20 years. So I wanted to start off by saying a little bit about what is corruption, what are we talking about here, and who are we talking about, before saying a little bit about the impacts and what we can all do about this. So the what and the who, first of all. Well, perhaps the best way to illustrate our take on this and the kind of work we do is to start by giving you, just in headline form, a few of the cases that we've recently or are currently working on. So starting with the case of a former president of Ukraine who succeeded in transferring a palatial presidential residence which belonged to the state to companies which appear to be controlled by him. Then you have a former oil minister in Nigeria. He managed, when he was the oil minister, to transfer a particularly valuable oil block from the government to a company which he controlled, worth over $1 billion. A third case I'll mention, involving the family of the chief minister of one of the states in Malaysia, Sarawak. They offered to sell to our undercover investigators tracts of forest and land, including forest and land belonging to indigenous people, which they had acquired from the state at knockdown prices. And then lastly, I'll mention a case which I've been working on very recently, which concerns the jade business, jade the gemstone, in Myanmar, not very far from here. What we found is that this business may be worth as much as $31 billion a year, and yet it's controlled by a rogues gallery of a former military dictator, cabinet members, army companies, and the country's most infamous drug lord. So far, this may all sound quite familiar. You've got political figures, they're misusing their office to profit personally. But what we've seen increasingly, and this ties in with the comments which Kate made in the introduction, is that corruption is a truly globalized business. It goes way beyond these kinds of people. And in fact, the disturbing thing is that you've got some of the finest minds in the financial services and legal services industries devoted to helping to steal money from some of the planet's poorest. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, I'll mention 3 things which we find crop up a great deal in the kind of cases that we look at. The first is the misuse of what might be called anonymous companies or shell companies, companies with hidden ownership. These are amazingly easy to set up. In fact, it can take you a matter of minutes if you've got a high-speed internet connection. Now, why do these matter? Well, the reason is because if you're a corrupt politician, it's very easy for you to transfer a presidential residence, a jade mine, an oil block, a tract of forest, to a company which is run under somebody else's name, but which you yourself control. And in fact, the World Bank did a study of 213 major corruption cases that took place between 1980 and 2010. And what they found was that in 70% of these cases, these anonymous companies, these shell companies, were the vehicle of choice for the corrupt. The other very striking thing which they found, which very much dovetails with what we see in our work, is that in fact the top 2 countries, the top 2 jurisdictions for creating these shell companies were the United States and the United Kingdom and its overseas territories and crown dependencies. Secondly, you've got banks. Now, if you're a corrupt politician and you've succeeded in stealing a large amount of money from your fellow citizens, you don't have to hide it under the mattress. There is a very good chance that you will find an international bank willing to launder your money. And in the cases that we've looked at over the years, we found there are some very prominent names which are involved in this, names like HSBC, Citibank, UBS, NatWest, Royal Bank of Scotland, and so forth. The third element, which we come across quite a lot, and bear in mind we particularly work on natural resource-related cases, is the role of international oil, gas, and mining companies. Now, to loop back for a second to a case I mentioned at the beginning, the one involving the former oil minister in Nigeria who transferred an oil block to a company that he controlled. Well, What subsequently happened was that that oil block got transferred to two very well-known international oil companies, Shell and the Italian oil company Eni. And what happened was that those companies transferred $1.1 billion to the Nigerian government at the same time that they paid the same amount of money to the former minister. The two oil companies claimed that they had no idea who they were effectively doing business with, but evidence that emerged subsequently in a court case showed that they had been negotiating directly with the former oil minister in the case of Shell over iced champagne, according to one witness. So what is the impact of all of this? It's often said that corruption is not a victimless crime, and it's well worth repeating and reflecting on what that means. In the first instance, you've got this tremendous loss of revenues which should be used for development, not least in some of the country's poorest regions. Now, I mentioned before the World Bank did a study of these 213 major corruption cases. They calculated that those cases alone had lost governments around $56 billion, which could have been spent on development. Coming back again to the report done by Kofi Annan and the Africa Progress Panel, they looked at a set of cases in Democratic Republic of Congo where incredibly valuable metals mines had been transferred from the government to very obscure hidden companies incorporated in the Caribbean. This had lost the state, they found, $1.3 billion, which is almost as much as double the health and education budgets for a single year in Congo. Another case I referred to earlier, the jade in Myanmar, well, worth about $31 billion potentially. That's about 46 times spending on healthcare in that country. But the very important thing to remember here is that corruption and all this money flying around the world, it's not just a missed opportunity. It's actually empowering some of the most dangerous opponents of peace and democracy around the world. And there are a great many cases that we and others have worked on in which you see highly corrupt regimes using those proceeds to oppress their own citizens, to deny them their rights, in some cases to wage war on their own people or sometimes other countries. And some of those that we've worked on include neighboring Cambodia, neighboring Myanmar, amongst several others. And the other thing to note, which ties in with another contribution by another speaker here earlier today, Paul Polman, is what this does to legitimate business. Paul Polman is part of a group called the B Team, which was set up to make business better and make a better contribution to global society. And they put out their own report earlier this year looking at corruption, in which they concluded that corruption added almost 10% as an additional cost to doing business around the world. So what do we do about this? I'll just highlight a few things to do with these specific aspects of the global corruption business which we're working on, and then finish with a couple of thoughts about what you all can do. So in terms of the policy measures needed to get at these problems, well, what should we do about anonymous companies, for instance? Our view, and that of an increasing number of people around the world, including many in governments, in fact, is that what's required is much more transparency around the ownership of companies, the real owners of companies, not the nominees, not the directors whose names appear on the ledger in the corporate registry, but the real owners. And really what you're going to need in the end is open public registers of who these owners are. Now, there are countries which are starting to engage on this issue. There's the EU, which has passed legislation. UK is doing things. You've got countries elsewhere in the world, including Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cameroon, Mongolia, the Philippines, are all starting to get at this issue, but there's a very long way to go. Banks. Well, with this, in a way, sadly, it's more basic. What's required is penalties which fit the crime for bankers who are involved in laundering money. Penalties which take a hit on their bonuses, serious fines, possibly even jail time in the most extreme cases. Because the evidence shows that unless we get to that stage, the anti-money laundering regulations will simply not be taken seriously. And what about the oil and gas companies? Well, again, there is some traction there. There is now a global standard emerging which requires now 2/3 by value of oil, gas, and mining companies globally to report publicly on what they're giving to governments in taxes and other payments. Still another third to go. So I'll finish just quickly on things that you can all do. So I'd leave you with two thoughts. One, work to expose corruption. Not something to be undertaken casually. Can be very dangerous, but I mention it because actually a lot of the detection of corruption, or at least detection of risks of corruption, comes through accessing and analyzing publicly available data. And the second thing I would urge you to consider is use your influence and networks to raise the demand for change, to raise the demand for an end to corruption. And I'm leaving you with these two particular thoughts because one of the things we're seeing in our work is just the extraordinary change in which people can access information and analyze it and disseminate it. And your generation, far more than any before, is incredibly well equipped to take advantage of these opportunities. And we are looking forward very much to following your lead in tackling this critical global issue. Thank you.
Okay. Big cheer for the final group of delegate speakers. Woo!
Awesome. Take it away. Yes, you introduce.
Okay, good afternoon. Pleasure to be in Bangkok. It is my role first to introduce our two speakers. For the ones of you that do not know, Venezuela gave birth to the greatest South American ever, Simón Bolívar. 2 centuries ago, this man got on his horse, traversed the Andes, and gave independence to 5 countries, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. But lo and behold, this 21st century, the magical Venezuela that has everything to prosper and have great levels of development, has been living under a government that mismanaged its economy, clamped down on free press, persecuted the opposition, and threw in jail lots of young people for tweeting against the government. The most massive form of corruption that can take place is when democracy and rights get taken away from people. And I can tell you that there's a date coming soon, December 6th, when Venezuela has a chance through the ballot box to hold elections and change course. And in no small part, remember, mark my words, Venezuela will take a different path because many young people in Venezuela, like Bolívar, when he got on his horse, they're now being beamed up to the sky, and through YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are spreading a message of regaining democracy, getting freedom back. And when you are invited to the 2045 One Young World Forum, they'll be talking about 2 remarkable Venezuelans that in December 6, 2015, gave it their all to have democracy back in the land of Simón Bolívar. Please give it up and welcome Carlos Vargas and Mario Di Giovanni from the magical land of Venezuela.
Esteemed counselors,
prominent young leaders of the world,
we want to ask a favor from you. Take your mobile out and wave them. Now, what we want you to do is to tweet, "I believe in the power of youth," to #EndCorruptionNow. I believe in the power of youth to #EndCorruptionNow.
corruption upsets every element of society as it undermines political development, democracy, and more.
Venezuela drops 15 on the most corrupted countries in the world. And last year, over 40 Venezuelans were killed in peaceful protests. So we know that the fight against corruption is not easy. I personally was injured 3 years ago, protesting peacefully for free and fair elections. I received 35 stitches in my left eye from a rock thrown at me by some government sympathizers. That day, I understood that I had a responsibility to create change. So the first thing I want to say to you is, change starts within ourselves. The second thing I want to say to you is, after we change, we need to spread the word. So that's why I became a representative of the Venezuelan student movement. And I can tell you that the first thing we did when those inhuman acts started to happen was understanding why this was about fighting for our dignity. Then we took the streets, and we were able to mobilize more than 50,000 students and countless citizens from a massive campaign in social media, assemblies, and word of mouth. So the third thing I want to say to you is people are willing to act when they understand the reason. It's as simple as that. We, as young leaders, can create meaningful actions if we understand the value of it, we are coherent with ourselves, and we get this message out to all our generation.
In 2010, I saw the need to defend the electoral rights of an increasing number of Venezuelans living abroad. I created Voto Donde Sea, Vote From Wherever in Spanish, an NGO based in Miami, Florida, with the goal of informing, facilitating, and promoting voting rights of Venezuelans who had left the country. What began as a small movement in Miami soon became an international movement with young activists who shared the same idea. Being away should not mean that you cannot decide the future of your own nation. We confronted our biggest challenges in the 2012 and 2013 Venezuelan presidential elections. The Venezuelan government wanted to make it more difficult for us to vote, so it deliberately closed the Venezuelan consulate in Miami. This forced us to travel over 900 kilometers to New Orleans, Louisiana, where it placed the nearest polling station. As many Venezuelans could not afford the long journey, we embarked in a campaign to collect funds and organize transportation. We ended taking over 5,000 Venezuelans in the two elections, the 2012 and 2013 elections. This came to be known as the biggest human mobilization to participate in an election in history. So why was it so important to fight for our right to vote? Because if we don't vote, there is no accountability. Voting is the strongest tool you have to make sure that your governments act with integrity.
Today, thanks to technology and globalization, each of us holds in our hand a power to cause change, to cooperate as global citizens to eradicate corrupt practices from our world. Do you remember the tweet you sent? Okay, now what we want you to do is to find every person that tweeted through the hashtag and follow them, so that we can together form an international movement to promote governmental integrity.
To conclude, we want to leave you the first task as young promoters of government integrity. 2 weeks from now, Venezuela will have legislative elections. The past electoral processes in Venezuela have been plagued by corruption and fraudulent actions by the government, using state resources towards their own advantage and imprisoning those who oppose them, including student activists and top opposition leaders.
So on the 6th of December, we need all of you to become international observers of this electoral process. We need you to become the voice of those Venezuelans that have been silenced by the government. Please take close attention to this event and expose any abuse or human right violation that might happen.
Imagine for a second that somebody asks you, when everything was wrong, when everything was dark, what did you do? Did you just sit there with your arms crossed? Did you just look the other way while corruption was taking over your country? Leadership is most needed when the storm arrives. We must use all the tools at our disposal to make sure that our governments act with integrity.
We will never sit with our arms crossed.
We will always stand against corruption, and we hope you do it too.
I have the great honor now of introducing our next speaker, Shashaneo Paul Oluwabumi from Nigeria. Paul is an energy expert. He's currently based in Vienna, working with the OPEC Foundation to find creative solutions to energy challenges facing countries in the developing world. He has a degree with distinction from Cranfield in the UK. He's worked as a One Foundation Global Young Ambassador, successfully lobbying members of Parliament in London and also the EU regarding levels of aid flows overseas. Paul himself has confronted very directly the challenges of energy shortages. When he grew up, he had to study at night by candlelight because of power outages. And he's grown up with a very strong sense of the need to tackle this problem and also some of the problems of governance and lack of leadership which lie behind it. So he's been involved in Nigeria in programs to empower girls to take more part in engineering and also to train young people in leadership and integrity. So I'll give the floor to Paul now. Please give him a big hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A very good afternoon to you all. Oil and gas apparently accounts for 75% of Nigeria's economy. I say apparently because we don't really know what happens to all the money. Over $12 billion every year is not accounted for across the whole supply chain, from the government and even down to the community. In oil-rich Nigeria, currently, unemployment is high, and over 60% of the population live in poverty, and not just poverty, but also energy poverty. It is unacceptable, I believe, that in a resource and energy-rich country like Nigeria, most still suffer from power cuts and an inadequate electricity infrastructure. I remember as a young boy, I used to study with the kerosene lantern every night so I could achieve my dreams of becoming an engineer. And I would always remember that cold winter morning in the United Kingdom when I was working as an expatriate. And my doctor looked at me and she told me that I would need to use eye drops every day for the rest of my life and spectacles because of the damage done to my eyes while I was young. This is not just my personal story, and I dare say it's the same for most of my peers back at home. And this needs to change. So it's not a wonder that 40 million Nigerian youths between the ages of 18 and 35 are scrambling to get out of the country. But now the big question is this. If we all leave Nigeria, we would be left to champion the cause of integrity. Because I strongly believe that we all need to work together. So my brother established a non-governmental organization, and I became his first director of operations. We called it Salvage Africa. And we had a very big dream and a very big motto. We called it Redefining Standards in Africa Through Leadership. We reasoned that true leadership relies on integrity. And if we could gather a group of young people who shared our passion for change in Nigeria, and not just in Nigeria, but in Africa as a whole, that gradually, integrity through effective leadership could become embedded into our government. So we started organizing seminars with university students, with government officials, and with lawyers. And these seminars formed the base of what Salvage Africa does. We also partnered with the Lagos State government, with corporate financial institutions and large national banks in Nigeria. And a key point for us was a partnership with Shell Petroleum Nigeria and the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, which is a body that was set up by the presidency to combat corruption in Nigeria. These talks and these seminars, which were held every quarter at the University of Lagos in collaboration with the Faculty of Law, are published as a compendium of legal articles. And these articles on integrity are distributed to all those who come for our programs and also to the young people in our sponsors organizations. To date, I am happy to say we've reached over 1,400 youths who are now championing the cause of integrity across Nigeria by running seminars even in their own local communities. If there's anything that this experience has taught me, it has made me understand that if you have a dream and a passion to change your country, start with fear, start trembling, but just start and don't fold your hands. And then I left Nigeria to study in the United Kingdom on an international scholarship. And I was appointed the United Kingdom Youth Ambassador for the One campaign. And as a team, we lobbied international oil companies to publish in newspapers and on websites all monies paid to the government. We took our campaign to the United Kingdom Parliament and as far as contacting members of the European Parliament. We received a lot of support from David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, from Nick Clegg, the Deputy British Prime Minister, and from Lord John Brown, the former Chief Executive Officer of British Petroleum. And I'm very happy to tell you that in March, Statoil, for the first time, published for the first time all payments to the government for oil extraction. The British government has also mandated that all UK-based extractive companies report their payments to the government anywhere in the world. The first of these reports will be published in 2016 next year. And I really believe that this is a huge step in ensuring integrity. You know, when I was younger, when I was growing up in Nigeria, I remember my teachers telling me, it's a saying, it has become a maxim that has become trite to overuse, that, oh, youths are the leaders of tomorrow, youths are the leaders of tomorrow. University youths are the leaders of tomorrow. High school youths are the leaders of tomorrow. And I was always asking myself a question, that when will tomorrow come? When will tomorrow come? But do you know what? I have stopped asking myself that question. I have discovered that it is better for me to take today as tomorrow by ensuring that governments live and work with integrity and transparency. And I enjoin us to all do the same. So I'm creating these call to action, and I'm asking every youth here to contact extractive companies in their home countries and put pressure on your governments, lobby them and talk to them, and publish what royalties, taxes, and levies that these extractive companies pay to your government. Why am I saying this? Because of the citizens, if they understand how much money accrues to them, they can actually ask the government that what are you doing with the money and what are you doing with our funds? I strongly believe, again, that we owe it to our next generation and ourselves to have a world that has integrity as its watchword and is free of poverty and indeed energy poverty. I want us to know that failure is an option, yes, fear is an option, but complacency is not. The future lies with us, and our born children are waiting for us to take action. One young world. One young world. Say yeah. Yeah, thank you. One young world. Yeah, thank you. One young world, I hope and I believe that sometime in the nearest future, before our generation is old and gray, corruption will be defined in all languages and all dictionaries as an ancient practice that is no longer in existence. And then we can actually say that, yes, we are for the good fight. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Fantastic. I have the pleasure of introducing the young lady to the left of me. And I will say as a preamble, whilst we've acknowledged that corruption is truly global in nature, it seems that we are still defining corruption within a very narrow boundary. And we may leave people with the tacit assumption that corruption is what happens in Africa and Latin America and maybe Asia. But when the richest nation on the earth has 3 million of its own citizens in prison, privately owned for-profit prison, there is corruption. When Iraq is bombed on a bunch of lies, and then defense contractors make hundreds of billions of pounds rebuilding the country they have just destroyed, there is unfathomable corruption. When bankers are bailed out to the tune of hundreds of billions of pounds in the UK for mismanaging their so-called free market businesses and the national economy, and they get to keep their jobs and continue making billions of pounds, there is unfathomable corruption. Where there is corporate tax avoidance, there is corruption. When the rich, now developed countries impose upon the poorer countries of the world economic policies they themselves did not use to develop, there is corruption. But most importantly, I want to come back to the final part, foreign intervention. There is corruption. Why is this relevant to the young lady I'm going to introduce beside me? Because the young lady beside me, Bibi La Luz Gonzalez, La Luz means the light, is from a country called Guatemala. For those who don't know the history of Guatemala, in 1954, like many other Latin American countries and countries across the world before and since, Guatemala made the sin of offending international big business and saying to the United Fruit Company, well, we actually don't want you to own our country anymore. And there was a United States-backed coup in Guatemala. There's been a coup in many other countries in South America and across the world. And this is one of the challenges, if we're going to talk about corruption, we have to be honest, that the poorer countries also face the reality of outside pressures to allow their economies to be destroyed. Bibi's father actually wrote a book about this particular subject called Osasuna Transparencia. My Spanish is obviously very, very bad. So this is important. So Bibi herself, someone who specialized in political economics, as a political economist by background, wanted to go into government herself, wanted to follow her father and become a diplomat, but frustrated with the way government really works, decided not to. And instead has currently founded a non-for-profit organization called Eat Better Waik, which means healthy food. It means having healthier food in Kichi, which is a Mayan language. And what her organization essentially does is educate young people and their parents about healthy access to food and about ways in which they can think about what they take into their body and become more conscious. Why is this important? Because in countries like Guatemala, one of the legacies of the things that I've spoke about is that many, many poor people across the globe do not have access to land. Because companies, not always companies that are within their nation, own the masses of the land in those countries. So it's very, very important that we address this issue. Bibi is going to talk to you about the social cost of corruption. One more time for Bibi La Luz Gonzalez, please, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Buenas tardes a todos los que hablan español. Bien. Good afternoon, everyone. Corruption and cynicism has left Guatemalans adrift. The social cost of corruption amounts to almost 3 million children left without school lunches and supplies. 1 million food bags undelivered to undernourished areas in the country. More than 1 million children lacking sufficient nutrients to develop without vaccination, and at least 500,000 women without proper care at childbirth. More than half of Guatemalan's population, its 16 million inhabitants, live in poverty, and ranks first in undernourishment rates in the region. Inequality gaps are widening, while 30% of the national budget is vulnerable to corruption. 80% of rural areas are affected by food insecurity, unemployment, extreme weather conditions, stuck in a nutrition-based trap, and under miserable healthcare conditions, if any. Moreover, government aid is weak in reaching the people most in need and inadequately handles food aid and crop production incentives. Instead, allocated budget has been embezzled in private favors and individual gain. And this was revealed by the UN's International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, CICIG, and the Public Ministry. The president and vice president were forced to resign amid public lobbying after irrefutable evidence of them defrauding the country of approximately $65 million. 2015 was a historic year for Guatemala, when youth led 5 months of massive peaceful demonstrations of up to 100,000 people protesting against high-ranking officials of mounting corruption. We were fed up with such abuse of power. We're not fools. An awakened society through social media put itself together from a torn and violent past to protest without civil unrest. This united population, historically divided, we all finally sang together, loudly and proudly, our national anthem, demanding the resignation of government officials, demanding justice, reforms, and end of corruption. So every corruption discovery sparked another surge of demonstrations and saw how an elected government fell apart. We woke up one glorious morning without a president. That was good. He had finally resigned and was then imprisoned, just like his vice president. Steps have initiated to lift the country out of impunity. However, other government branches need to follow as a way to eliminate a corrupt system that has been corroding our country. I am extremely happy I am part of this moment, writing academic articles, speaking up to international media. I've jointly developed a civic involvement project. I am part of groups that rallied people to take part of the protests, and even more so, being here in front of you. However, corruption has left the country with unprecedented health and food crisis. Corruption by our government has led to poor planning and execution of government programs, of development programs as well. There's a general misconception about food and nutrition, which inhibits proper intellectual and physical development of children. This needs to stop. So I have created an organization called Eat Better Waik to fill a void that government has neglected, to teach food awareness. I am tackling core problems in the country, combining education, access to food, budget, and adequate food intake for specific ages. With partnerships, I'm leading a project in an elementary school to supplement students with nutritious meals to overcome its low 17 cents allocated budget for children's meals. I am determined to expand globally and become a social business, to educate and offer healthy products accessible to low-income families. Guatemalan's movement against corruption has been inspirational to other Latin American countries. A critical youth is here to stay. Government stole so much from us. They also stole our fear. We will critically analyze words and action. We have the power of writing, of speaking up, and organizing. Corruption pushed us to be even more engaged. So, what I urge you all to do is to analyze and monitor your government's proposals very, very closely. There, inconsistencies can be spotted. By uniting peacefully, public demands can be enough to disrupt corruption, reduce inequality, and eradicate poverty. Thank you.
Very good. Fantastic, fantastic. You know, I've been spending this past 2 days watching from the back every one of you amazing one young world. And there was a time when I was telling Sabrina I was giving up hope of finding solutions for all the problems that are happening now. But with all you here, I really find that we still have hope. And thank you to Kate and David for what you're doing, really. Thank you. I've met Sabrina Vetter just half an hour ago, and I felt I know you from a long, long time. I don't believe in coincidences. There's always a cause for everything. And when we were talking, I was asking you why you're doing what you're doing. And she said, well, I have passion for people, and I want to make a difference. I want to make this place a better world. And Sabrina Vetter, she studied international business law. She's working with Siemens now. And she was telling me the story how it all started. And it's in 2008 when Siemens had a corruption issue in Brazil. And it was very big. And you know, Siemens has around 400,000 people all over the world in 190 countries in the world. So it was going to be very difficult for Siemens to continue if they didn't do something about that. So in 2009, Sabrina became part of, as an internship you were doing there. And they created the Collective Action Team. This Collective Action Team, where she's working now with two other people, there are three, they are working for transparency, to find ways of meeting the public, the private, and the civil society, the NGOs, working together for doing transparency. Now Siemens is doing really well. They are doing amazing things, especially in alternative energy, in building a transport, electric transport, doing incredible things for the people. And that's what we were talking about with Sabrina, that what are we doing? If we are elected officials in government, it's to serve. If companies do it, it's for profit. But if you don't see the profit for the people and working together, you can never find a solution that it's positive. It always will be negative. It's also like wars, like peace is more difficult than war. It's easier to make war. but it's more difficult to create peace. And so we have to work always together, the private, the public, and the civil society, in order to have success stories like Simon's. She will tell you better. I'm amazing but what you have in your story, what it is. So please, Sabrina Vetter with you from Germany.
Corruption hits poor people the hardest. Imagine you cannot afford to pay a bribe requested by a teacher to enroll you at school, and your education will be blocked. Similarly, imagine you cannot afford to pay a bribe requested by an official at a driving school. You may never acquire a driver license, which could further block your job opportunities. Corruption brings us to the real cause of poverty, because it simply hinders an individual, a society, and a country from realizing its economic potential. Corruption is a problem that is ever present, touches all of us, and can only be tackled by joint action. We call it collective action. The idea is to engage multiple stakeholders from private sector, public sector, the civil society, and to interconnect them and to make them to act in concert. An important driving force for collective action is our Siemens Integrity Initiative, which is part of comprehensive settlements with the World Bank and the European Investment Bank. We are supporting over 50 anti-corruption projects in over 20 countries. In the last 3 years, I've been realizing that it's really collective action which trigger the much-needed change of ethical behavior and policy reform. So let me give you an example how effective collective action can be. In Egypt, for example, corruption is seen as the 5th biggest obstacle for doing business. Furthermore, at least 40% of the population perceives that most of the government officials are corrupt. And for that reason, we support the Cairo University in Egypt, with which we aim at contributing to raise a new generation, a generation which is committed to say no to corruption, and therefore to help to end corruption. And the success about this project is that after 4 years of project implementation, students now tell us that they stop paying bribes to the policemen instead of the traffic fines. And moreover, one graduate who was asked to pay a bribe when he applied for some official papers for his military draft did not only refuse to pay a bribe, but also reported, brave enough, this incident so that an investigation and further action was taken. You might now ask how this behavioral change among the Egyptian students has been achieved. And from my perspective and experience, it's a combined approach of research, collective leadership, and education. With research, the students of the Cairo University, together with the professors, they tried to identify the most vulnerabilities in their environment. And then they demonstrated collective leadership by championing and officially committing to their own code of ethics. After that, the project went over from collective leadership to education, and the knowledge of corruption and transparency has been integrated into the students' academia curricula, so that the students have been able to even better apply integrity and promote integrity. What we need are more of such good projects. And therefore, I'd like to call everyone to inspire others to act collectively. It doesn't necessarily have to be such a project. Simply saying no to corruption can contribute to fight it. So finally, let me inspire you and give you some simple ideas how you personally can say no. Raise awareness. Engage other peers and discuss the cost of corruption in your country. Help to spread the word, and also share the negative and the positive stories you've experienced or you listen to. and encourage the implementation of anti-corruption principles in your organization. Ask yourself and your colleagues, does your organization have a code of ethics, a compliance system? What is the ton from the top, from your management in terms of integrity? Dear friends, the young leaders, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to join forces to fight corruption and bring the issue to a wider audience. If we can succeed in at least sensitizing our peers about how to deal with corruption, this can lead to the last generation that accepts to corruption to be a normal or even acceptable state of affairs. Simply say, no.
Thank you. I've had the great pleasure of meeting Flavia Munteanu over lunch, and I've read her bio, what was sent to me, and whilst talking to you, Flavia, it was very refreshing. It was refreshing to see a young lady like yourself, still in graduate studies in the UK, so involved and so concerned about this cancer, which we have seen from Venezuela, from Nigeria, we've seen Guatemala, and I've seen also example from Germany, how this cancer is present everywhere, and how through actions with the youth, and all of you have said no to corruption. And I think today you have a story to tell us, a story that touches you to the very core, and a story that will also make us reflect as to what can be done with today's tool. And I think what you have done is, through your platform, using social media, how you feel you can touch other youth, not just from your country, but to bring attention to this important issue, which is corrupt practices, and why it is really going to the core of, and of course, denying people the rights as far as their rights are concerned, denying the fundamental rights. And as has been explained throughout this panel here, it shows how economic development is hampered by virtue of the fact that corruption is there, and even basic services are impacted by sheer corrupt practices. And as President Lee Kuan Yew has said, any corrupt decision impoverishes the country. And I think today you're here to explain your story as to why this is again, he has been vindicated again. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to be talking here today. Welcome to Moldova, the country which lost $1 billion from its national banking system. I repeat, $1 billion has been lost. To put this into perspective, it's about 1/8 of our GDP. Otherwise said, every single Moldovan will have to work for 6 weeks every year to repay the debt. Ironically, the officials who stole the money are the very people I campaigned for in the revolution of 2009. Once promised to be the model performer of the European Union's Eastern Partnership Programme, Moldova now boasts Europe's most corruption-saturated system. The country's former Prime Minister, Vlad Filat, was publicly arrested and stripped of political immunity. The government has fallen, following a vote of no confidence from Parliament. The main suspect of the investigations is a 28-year-old businessman called Ilan Shaw, who was placed under house arrest, only to be released a month later and allowed to run in the elections in the mayoral town. He won with 62%. Wedged between Romania and Ukraine, the former Soviet state is torn between a string of weak EU coalitions and the pull of Moscow. Since my involvement in the protest of 2009, I've witnessed very little change. Moldova's fraudulent officials have been replaced by a pro-EU coalition responsible for the theft of the $1 billion. Perhaps this is the greatest change, the pocket of the embezzler. As I stand here today, speaking to all of you, 100,000 people are protesting in the capital. I was one of them in 2009. But this is not a second revolution for Moldova. This is the largest anti-corruption protest since the country's independence in 1991. And as the poorest country in Europe, Moldova simply cannot afford to become poorer. We cannot afford to pay for the greed of our officials. The billion-dollar fraud has generated widespread distrust and is a core root of the demonstrations. Presently, 40% of the country's population feel that life under the Soviet Union would be more financially secure than it is at the moment. Failure to prevent corruption has instilled a fear of mafia rule and a sense of Soviet nostalgia. So given its endemic nature, how can young people in Moldova, how can I attempt to address the problem? Considerable potential for reform exists in the youth sector, but it needs to be corroborated with efforts in civil society. And if there is hope to address the issue internally, government censorship should be countered first. A recent example involves a friend of mine who is a journalist. His report on corruption was censored before publication. Following a series of anonymous phone calls, the person in question was threatened with loss of employment. Reports detailing the activities of all the banks involved have been lost, and all electronic data has been deleted. And finally, even the van transporting crucial files regarding the investigation was stolen and later found burned. So a key avenue for effecting change is by calling upon the generation of bright young leaders who have left Moldova in pursuit of an education abroad. Very few share a desire to return home, given widespread disillusionment with the regime. I'm one of the members of that generation. In 2014, I drafted a set of policy recommendations for the Ministry of Education at home. This drew on my set of experience from the British educational system and was included in workshops for civil society and teachers. I identified bribery as a key problem in primary and secondary education in Moldova, but also corruption is widespread in the justice and police systems. Presently, my main efforts of addressing corruption are through a non-profit organization which I founded a year ago. It's called newestplatform.org. And what we do is to give journalists and analysts from Eastern Europe a voice, an independent voice in the West. We link them to policymakers and governments in the West and listen to their voices, which they can't express freely in Eastern Europe. Our estimated audience is 20,000 readers, and we have commissioned intelligence reports on the Moldovan theft case. Additionally, I'm addressing the issue through discussion panels and think tanks in order to raise awareness of the gravity of the situation. And presently, I'm also collaborating with an audit agency investigating officials involved in Moldova's embezzlement case from the UK. With the fall of the European government, the country's future relies on young people who write freely, who speak freely, and who act as stakeholders in civil society. The government can counter the notion of a mafia rule by incentivizing young people, young leaders to return home. This new generation should learn from past mistakes, as well as from education abroad, and launch a system of anti-corruption. Alongside others, I would like to identify with that generation, and I would like to return home. We may have lost the stolen billion, but we haven't given up hope for good governance. And I urge each of you One Young World leaders, to become watchdogs for corruption, to speak up, and bring Moldova's untold story to the fore of the international agenda. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we go to the open mics. If we can have one person at each microphone, please. And if we can have a councillor go down into the floor to man each microphone. Now, remember, fast as possible. You don't need to say who you are because that's what the councillors are going to do. They're going to introduce. So if each councillor can go down and stand at a microphone, and what you basically do is you say, here's the person's name and the country they're from, and then they ask their really short question. So just the question, as we said before, you're getting really good at this. You don't need to say your name, that will have been said, and you don't need to set up your question. President, if we can go to your microphone, please.
I'm Jam from the UK. So my question is mainly for Akala, and he described some issues really well, so thank you for being so brave for describing some of those issues. So in the Western world, we talk a lot about corruption, and Mike clearly described how some of the UK laws and US laws facilitate these corruptions. So if that's the case, surely our governments are corrupt too. So my question really is, why don't we acknowledge corruption in these areas, and why do we only acknowledge it in certain areas? So, and how can we solve corruption if all corruption is not acknowledged?
Great, thank you. And we'll come back and answer those from the floor at the end of the Q&A session. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hashim Noor. And my question is that in many countries, especially in my country, Pakistan, many of the political leaders have access to strong militant groups. And these militant groups have no regard whatsoever for human life. So basically, how do we raise our voices against these people who will do whatever they want to stop us?
Great, thank you. Now, Carla, can you, if you introduce the person who's going to ask just their name and the country they're from, that'd be great, thank you.
Yes. I have with me Gift, and she's from Thailand.
Hey.
Yes, so my question is, so I think education and family institution is the best place to start getting rid of corruption. So how can we get started with that?
Terrific, thank you. Ivonne, if you just introduce the...
So I'm presenting Meral Dusgun from London. She's going to speak about a young girl arrested in the UK fighting against ISIS.
Hi, my name's Meryl. Yesterday in the UK, a British-born 18-year-old Kurdish girl was convicted of 21 months in jail. Her crime, joining the PKK, the Kurdish fighters currently fighting against ISIS. Is it not down for our governments as democratic nations to take on leadership and to expose the corruptness behind the stereotyping of Kurdish people in particular, a stateless people of 30 million, to give them the confidence to have the belief that they too have equality? Is it not down to our governments to take on the leadership to provide this for people who are challenged from every corner, and especially being challenged by the dictatorial Turkish corrupt nation states?
We'll ask one of our presidents to comment on that when we come back onto the stage. President Ameenah, would you mind introducing the person at your microphone?
I have Marc-Alain Bouclot from Haiti, and I think he has a very interesting question on unicity and glory. Is that right? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I am very, very inspired, and I'm very happy that young leaders came here and spoke about the movement against corruption. Unfortunately, corruption is not just a matter of government. It's government and it's private sector. Everybody get involved. It's a little bit more complicated. My question is coming from, as a young Haitian, generations before me, 30 years ago, were young, and then they were saying they were against corruption. And today, they are the ones who are leading corruption. My question is, you young leaders, I would like to hear from you, as when your movement gets higher, when you get recognized, when you get seen, how do you handle staying to the cause while interacting with those already popular who wants to steal from your audience? Thank you.
Great question. We'll have one of them answer. Now, you're doing a brilliant job, so we can do one more question from each mic. President.
All right, we have now Jacqueline from Singapore who wants to inquire as to, coming from Singapore, paradigm of a clean governance country, how can they help other countries where they see corruption? Jacqueline.
In countries with integrity, each vote counts during elections, but what do you think is the good of a voting system in a corrupted country? During Malaysia election 2 years ago, unexplained new ballot boxes of false votes were added after deliberate blackout. Just Google Malaysia election blackout and you will see lots of creative and other ways of buying their votes through. Malaysians were left feeling helpless. They reached out to several leaders of other countries, but all they heard were what you and me heard in the news. Congratulations to the winning party. Despite news and pictures of such dark election, no words or actions were taken by any country. I understand that it could be due to some conflicts of interest for politically that is stopping the countries from getting involved in the business of other countries. But we have to realize that political corruption may lead to an inefficient government, which will in turn become a world issue. As much as we are of different nationality, we are all of one human race. So my question is, what can we as citizens or leaders of other countries do to assist the helpless citizens in corrupted countries? Thank you.
Thank you. President Quiroga, if you'd like to come back to the stage. Mike from your mic.
Yep, we've got a question now from Stuart from South Africa.
Thank you. Fred Swaneker, in his TED Talk, makes the point that developing nations require great leaders, not because of how much good needs to be achieved, but simply because the amount of negative that a poor leader can do in a developing society is so much more, because of a lack of controls and institutions that developed markets have. I would argue that this is probably the reason why in places that go through coups, the replacement leader who you campaign for is then the same person that takes the money tomorrow. What institutions and controls most need to be built in developing societies to limit corruption?
Terrific, thank you. Akala.
I have Aziz, and he's Iraqi-Irish.
Hi guys, it's been a very interesting talk today, so I thank all the speakers and the delegates as well. I wanted to ask a question to the President of Mauritius. I work in regulatory mediation in the banking sector, and we're constantly looking at ways of fighting sanctions, corruption, bribery, and money laundering. Now, one of the observations that I have is I think the private sector is actually doing a good job in terms of flagging corruption to central banks and identifying suspicious activity, particularly when you're talking about government officials. But one observation that I've seen is that central banks don't necessarily process that data or actually have follow-up on the actions in certain countries in the Middle East that I've worked in. What can we be doing as a government to address that, and how can we be putting pressure on central banks to follow up on these? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Akala, if you want to come back up to the stage. Ivonne.
I'm presenting Yapa from Thailand. She will ask a question about corruption.
Hello. In certain markets where corruption is widespread, companies may actually face threats of business closures or delays, resulting in significant business costs when refusing to comply with authorities' requests for undue payments. So I would like to gain your perspective of how companies could best respond to such threats or action, and how could we ensure that these threats and actions are completely eliminated in the future. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. Ivonne, if you want to come back up. And President Ameenah, the final question from that microphone.
Yeah. I have Hassan Rada from Lebanon, and he has a question on corruption in Lebanon.
Thank you. As a Lebanese, I would love to talk about corruption in Lebanon. However, given that we have 19 dictators, which everybody of them has a private jet, that would take hours. Instead, I'm going to ask a question about what the private sector is doing with regard to ISIS. In Iraq, one of the main strengths of ISIS is that they're self-funded, and they're selling their oil to somebody else, a third party. Some people are mentioning Turkey, some people are mentioning some oil companies. What is being done in order to cut that funding and in order to make sure that that supply chain is cut so that ISIS doesn't have any funding anymore?
Terrific. Okay, so there was a good question about, we'll start maybe with the delegate speaker responding. When your movements grow, how do you stay true to the course, and how do you stop other people coming in and trying to subvert what you're up to? Would anyone, one of you like to take that?
Yes, I think it was from the one of the fellow leader from Haiti that was asking about this question. I'm really passionate about how can we as young people do not make the same mistakes that maybe 30 years from now, 30 years back, they made, and right now we have the problem of corruption. And I believe, as the fellow young leader from Thailand was saying in the first question, it's about education, but not only education in the family, but it is about our civic education in all of our countries. Okay, so what I think we need to do is to really understand what is the foundation of every society: solidarity, responsibility, tolerance, honesty. Those values that seems to be like not important at first, but it's really, really, really important that we acknowledge it as our own, so that we, in the future, when challenges may appear, we can stay true to our beliefs. So that's how I think we could stay focused with what we believe in.
Terrific. There was a great question about what good is a voting system in a corrupt country. I don't know if one of our presidents would like to share a point of view on that.
I wanted to mention something really fast, sorry to interrupt, about the voting system, and it's through the years I've had the chance to work in Venezuelan elections, in elections in Mexico, in elections in many places in South America, and I have seen that slowly we've begun to understand that young people really have a stance and we can really take action on what the election processes are. Really, in regards to international movement and international organizations and what they can do, the elections that we have coming up in Venezuela in 2 weeks are ones that may become a definite change for us, for the better or for the worse. So we're really calling on the international institutions to help opposition leaders, help student movements overcome the fraudulent actions that have been established. We have called different organizations such as the OAS to come and establish a system inside of Venezuela, and we need to assume as an international community that responsibility to really be present in these different electoral processes, because if not, if we leave it to the machinery of the government, if we leave it to the machinery of the state, then things can really go wrong and we might not be reflecting the answer of the people.
Great. President.
Yes, just a comment. First is, if you have a democracy with free press and institutions that you can trust, you have in place a framework with which you can take care of corruption, or at least denounce it, have it processed, investigated, and punished either judicially or at the ballot box. But that presumes that you have a functioning democracy with the components that allow you to punish it. I would tell the young people here gathered the following in terms of corruption. You have more tools than have ever been available at your disposal to do massive campaigns to uncover and punish corruption. When I was your age, I had a physical P.O. box. Good luck talking to someone on the phone from Singapore to Venezuela to Guatemala. Now you're all interconnected. You have access to information. And you have massive participation of women, which used to not be true a few generations ago. Women are by definition more honest. Keep them involved and keep them in the loop when it comes to fighting corruption. I will tell you the following is, if you want to fight corruption as young people, start campaigns with hashtags on "I will not bribe a policeman," "I will not bribe a judge." Publish what you pay if you work on oil or minerals, and make people in your governments and everywhere else join the campaigns where you have to publish absolutely every dollar that gets sent anywhere. But the point that was being made, what if you have the biggest form of corruption, which is an authoritarian regime that has a facade of elections and rigs the election and steals the election? That's the biggest form of corruption, I would submit to you, because if you can steal an election, then you can steal everything else. You can steal the money from the oil company, you can steal the money from taxes, from revenues and collection. So the biggest thing that you should demand in countries that do not have fully functioning democracies is basic elements like freedom of the press, like independent institutions, like alternability in government. The problem with ruthless authoritarian governments is that they do not know how to pack their bags. You should demand term limits. The government officials learn how to pack their bags and go home when their term is up, and mobilize the young people. What was said here about Venezuela is critical. In my part of the world, it's not as bad as in others. But when you have a government that can rig and steal elections, they can steal your future. And I think the young people have proven to be the key in terms of mobilizing and defending the vote. That should be the first thing you defend if you want to have a clean government, is prevent them from stealing the elections, because they will steal your future if you let them.
Terrific. What I'm now going to do, I'm just going to come to each of the councillors and either respond to a specific question that was pertinent to you, or just give me a closing remark.
Yeah, so I'd like to respond to a couple of the questions from the first mic. So Yeah, about acknowledging the role of Western countries in corruption. Yeah, completely agree. I mean, if you're looking at corruption capitals of the world, London, for instance, is well up there, because this is a place where you've got headquartered all manner of banks, which have an increasingly well-documented track record of taking dirty money. You've got other things which none of us have talked about, like a property bubble. Well, why is that? One of the reasons why is because there's a system in place which tacitly encourages all sorts of people with dirty money accrued in other countries to come and invest it in London's property market, which has all sorts of adverse implications for people in London, apart from anything else. And then the shell company problem. I mean, we did an investigation, for instance, where one UK company had been party to quite similar situation to what Flavia was describing, 700 million flowing through a bank in Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan. Guess what? One of the directors was dead. No one noticed. This is because the system is so bent that it's very easy to set up a company even with dead people as the nominal directors. I just want to link that to another question which came from the first podium about Singapore. And Singapore, I'm afraid to say, occupies a very similar position in the corrupt economy to London. It's squeaky clean on the outside. It takes a lot of dirty money. And you mentioned the issue of Malaysia. Well, we spoke to a lawyer in Malaysia who was proposing to us a bent deal, and he gleefully described how we'd do it in Singapore because, as he said, it's the new Switzerland. So it's the same thing. Clamp down on money laundering, impose severe penalties. And final message, just to echo what the president said, and actually something that Paul said too, is yeah, you guys, you have the most tremendous opportunity and tools which previous generations didn't have to make a difference on this, about raising awareness, but also getting through some of this data and making it mean something. It's no use us sort of proposing more transparency, more data out there if no one picks it up and uses it. But with the digital tools now available, that's really very much easier to do.
Terrific. Akala.
I think it's very important to have a historical understanding of development in that the earliest industrial societies, Western Europe, North America, Japan, none of them were anything remotely resembling any shade of democratic when they were developing. So it's very arrogant for those of us that are born in rich countries to attempt to impose on or wag our fingers at those countries that are now developing and say, you can't do what we did. You can't have slavery. You can't have child labor. You can't have no women participating in the political process. You can't steal all the land, etc. I'm not saying that we want to encourage those things. Of course we don't, and they should be opposed. But those of us that come from or are born in the richer countries should not get arrogant or be misleading about the way our countries came to be rich. A. B, final point, is that also foreign intervention, people must be very careful. I'll re-echo that point. We've seen with Iraq, we're seeing now with Syria, we've seen with Libya, yeah, foreign intervention, particularly military intervention, which people will often call for on their own countries when they're frustrated, usually makes the country even worse than it was under that scenario. Yeah. So for those of us that love people in the countries that we're talking about and want to express international solidarity, it's important that we actually encourage people and give them the tools to find their own solutions, but not military ones.
Woo. Ivonne.
Yes. I want to build up more of what you're saying, but also link it with a question, the last one, I think it was from a Lebanese, right? From Lebanon. And I'm partly Lebanese. I'm from South America, from Ecuador, but I'm so Lebanese. And I would just, because you were saying all this Lebanese with the private jets and ISIS, how you take the funding out of ISIS. And talking about the intervention, that they don't leave those countries, make their own democracy and live with their own democracy, but the intervention makes them worse, like what happened in Iraq. Look what we have now in Libya and Syria and all the places where they interfere. The problem that we have here is lack of leadership. It's true. It's lack of leadership, and you are the leaders now. You are the leaders. The thing you have to do, and that's why I'm going to say something maybe wrong, but I admire the Jews and the Israelis because they unite together, the diaspora, and they unite for a reason, for a cause. We, the Arabs, I'm talking as an Arab now, we are not united. We don't use our diaspora to unite for doing something than having just jets and women and other things. So we have to start getting together. You should start moving your diaspora as leaders. Choose a leader, but you have to protect that leader because the money has to be unconditioned. Get money, but it doesn't have to be conditioned. It's like I call the two-tempo kiss. I hold you from the neck, and then I oblige you to kiss. It should be a three-tempo kiss. I hold you from the neck. They hold me from the neck. I hold you from somewhere else, and then we kiss together as an equal, as equals. It's the only way. So you need this airbag protection, so the money that you gathered has to be not conditioned with the freedom to use it and to make a difference. It's going too far. We cannot find solutions. And if there is no solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arabs have one cause, the Palestinian. If there is no solution for that, there will be no stop of terrorism in the world, believe me. We have to move together, and the young generation, you are going to do it.
Great. President Ameenah, would you like to close the session with a summary comment for us, please?
Thank you. I think the advantage of speaking last is that most of the messages have gone out already. But I think if you look at the way to the reasons for having precisely corruption, I think we have identified the fact that you don't have a proper functioning democracy, you don't have elections, and very often the constitution has to be written in such a way that it cannot be tampered, so that you have to go for the election process. And when you don't have a change in government, very often you cannot see what has been happening before in terms of corrupt practices. Having said this, we know that corruption can be combated. It can be done through proper, highly regulated institutions. And one thing as well that we haven't touched on, I think, which has to come out as well, you can have governance, but you can still have corruption. This is something that we have to be very careful, because sometimes even the best governed country, you can still have corrupt practices happening. So again, we have to address this, but having highly regulated institutions, having transparency in the decision, also having protection of the whistleblowers. This is something that we haven't touched on. How do you protect? What are the regulations that need to be put in place to protect the whistleblowers, that the person can have the confidence to say it open? And how also is the press doing its homework in terms of exposing the corrupt practices? Because sometimes we also know what's going on in terms of the undercurrent of who is funding the press as well. Because in countries where you don't have independent press, you also have the issue of corrupt practices being hidden or not shown to its proper to the level that is being practiced. And as I say again, all corrupt decisions will impoverish people. And at the end of the day, we are touching the lives of people, so corruption has to be exposed, corruption has to be removed, and corrupt practices have to be reduced to a minimum. That's the message I have. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's give a huge round of applause to our councillors and delegate speakers. Woo!